very powerful presentation this morning, didn't we?
Yes.
About radical hospitality. And I think one of the things, as I've gotten older and the more that I study the Gospels and the life of Jesus Christ, I think that's the thing that I see over and over and over again, is in Jesus' interactions. Think about all the different people that Jesus interacted with. And what did he show? He showed welcome. He showed hospitality for those who were dispossessed, for those who were marginalized, for those who would even have considered themselves to be sinners in need of God's grace. Everyone who came, he was welcome. And I especially love the story of Zacchaeus. Because Zacchaeus really felt like he would never be welcome, so he went up and hid in a tree. And Jesus even looks up and says, Zacchaeus, come down. I'm coming to your house today. So Jesus lived that welcome in his ministry. And we are called, of course, to follow in his example, to reach out to our neighbors as living invitations. It's very easy, I think, to sit in our churches and say, well, everyone is welcome. We're going to invite everybody to come. But we are called to be those invitations. And that begins, I think, in relationships that we start to establish with people outside the doors of our churches and in our community. Wherever we are invitations for Christ Jesus, for people to come and be welcomed into his family. So it's both word and action. Next slide. Any of you ever hiked the Appalachian Trail? Amanda, did you do the whole thing?
No. But I grew up right next to it.
Rusty Rushing shared an article with me, and I'd like for you to write down the name of this article, because a lot of the information I'm going to share with you comes from this article. It's from you can find it on the web. It's called Fresh Expressions. Just Google Fresh Expressions. And the article that you'll want to reference is Cabin or Shelter, Which Are You? Fresh Expressions, Cabin or Shelter, Which Are You? And I just recommend that you read this article after we share some information with you today. I found it very enlightening. Basically, the author talks about there being two types of hikers when it comes to the Appalachian Trail. Does anybody know how long the trail is?
2,189.
Is it on there?
Yeah.
Oh, it is. I've forgotten I put that in there. From Georgia to Maine, I know one Moravian minister who did it. Bert Wrights did it in a series of years.
He did it the right way.
Yeah, he would go for like 3 weeks, and he would basically hike for those 3 weeks. He did not go for one day and hike the trail and then sort of hibernate for the night in a nice cabin and in luxury, but he stayed on the trail. So through hikers for the Appalachian Trail, they hike either whole or large parts of the trail over a course of days or weeks or months or years. And these are folks who normally don't stay in cabins, they stay in tents or shelters. And I'm going to show you a picture of a shelter in just a few minutes. The shelters are sort of unique in the sense that all kinds of people are sharing that shelter. You don't just stay with people who are in your family or in your group. You may have other people who are hiking the trail that stop for the night as well in the shelter. Then you have weekend hikers or day hikers, and they might hike just for a day or for a couple of hours on the trail, and then they're going to go back to a cabin or to a motel room, and they're going to hunker down, and they'll have a nice meal, and it'll be comfortable, and they'll have television and all this other nice accommodations. Cabins, isn't that a lovely cabin? Wouldn't you like to go stay there? Cabins are for people who want to take a holiday from the world. They are for comfort and stability. They are for hunkering down with the people that you know. Does that sound familiar? Hunkering down with the people you know. Okay. Then there are shelters. And shelters are for people who want to see the world as their mission. Shelters are buildings that are never quite closed off from the environment. They're for gathering with people you don't know in preparation, I like that, in preparation to go out on the trail again. Now, as you look at the cabin and you look at the shelter, which one of those do you think Christ would call us more to be in the world?
Shelter.
He would call us to be a shelter. Because what can happen if we stay in the cabin?
You become complacent.
You become complacent. You're only with the people that you know, that you're comfortable with, and
Like
you sort of like you. You sort of hunker down, or you get in this sort of bunker mentality of this is a fortress that will protect us from the world and what's happening in the world, the changes that are happening in the world. Comfortable. I wanted to share this with you from the article because I found it one of the most powerful statements. As the cultural landscape shifted away from Christendom, so did the centrality of church buildings in common life and society. Instead of being the social gathering spot for everybody and your grandmother, church buildings receded into the skyline as their once peak attendance began to decline. Even newer church buildings, full on Sunday, remained empty most of the week. They protected the church from the harsh outside world. They reflected the preferences of them who called them home. They disconnected from their neighborhood. They rejected anything that was not known or comfortable. In other words, church buildings became cabins. I'll tell you when this first hit me. I went to a seminar with an Episcopal priest about 8 years ago. And he was talking about some of these same issues we've been talking about today about neighborhood and community. And he said, I'm more than willing, if there's anybody in the group today, to come to your church tomorrow, and I will do an assessment. I will go around your church grounds, I will go in your building, and I will tell you what my impressions are after I leave, and I'll document that and give it to you. Guess what he said about Calvary? He said it reminded me of a fortress. He said the bushes were overgrown. He said you really couldn't see the sign. There were no signs to tell people where the sanctuary was located, where the offices were located. I mean, he went through this whole list of things. And that sort of hit us like a ton of bricks because we thought, well, we're the most wonderful, welcoming people to our neighborhood. We're a part of our neighborhood. Well, no, we really weren't. So we're in a situation here where we're trying to learn what it means to be neighbor and to address the next question. Are we a cabin? Are we a shelter? So what I would like for you to do, just with this preliminary information on your chair, there's an inventory. And there's 7 questions. And let's take about 3 or 4 minutes and just answer these, and it'll tell you to put 1 for cabin, 1 for shelter. It'll tell you what to do, but try and score your church. Don't give it a lot of thought. Just first thing that comes off the top of your head. Were you surprised?
No. Clearly cabin.
No. I was surprised at some of the ones that I put ones by. Not all of them, but I did not get a good score.
Well, I think one that's sort of different for us as Moravians is number 7. We have concentrated on foreign missions, but I think the difference would be if you concentrate only on foreign mission and missionaries and not only in local mission.
We do a lot of local.
Yeah,
things.
you do a lot of local.
Yeah.
Okay, just take this with you, and again, look on that website. It's excellent. with the article.
For those of you that don't know, well, Peace is in a unique situation in the we're in the midst of transition. To kind of put everything in context for what I'm going to speak about, you got to know a little bit of the backstory. And the backstory of Peace is that Congregation was originally founded in the mid-60s and located in the South Park area of Charlotte and known as Park Road Moravian Church. By the late 90s, however, the building that they had began to have some structural issues. At that same time, the South Park area of Charlotte, development was really, it started to explode. And a developer came in, and at the same time that the congregation was evaluating whether to repair the building or what to do, and a developer came in and in essence said, well, we'll be more than happy to kind of take this off your hands. You can go do something new. And that's what the congregation decided to do. And so they built a new building in the early 2000s, actually opened it in 2003. One of the things that, however, that they did, their congregation did, is they ran into some issues with construction that drove the cost of the building up. Probably built more than they should have. And in any event, they ended up incurring a lot more debt than they would have anticipated going into the venture. But they still felt like if you build it, they will come. So they built it. They didn't come. And over the years, the congregation continued to dwindle. In addition to that, the financial pressures became increasing until the point where they became unbearable. And in 2015, faced with this massive debt, the congregation was really forced to make the decision to sell the property. And so they sold the property in 2015 to another church, Hope Community Church, that had actually been meeting on the premises of Peace. I came in August of 2016 as a student pastor. And at that point in time, we were still meeting on the property. We were in the parsonage, which we renamed the Moravian House. And that was our offices and our place of worship. When I came in, the congregation, after the sale of the property, the congregation had a couple of decisions that they could make. They could merge with another congregation, they could disband, but they said they wanted to start over. They wanted to try something new. And so I was brought in as a student pastor in 2016, accepted the call as the installed pastor in November of 2017. And faced with the situation of, we don't have a building. At that point in time, we were still on the property. We had sold it, but we were able to stay there for a year. We had to make some adaptive decisions. How are we going to move forward? Where are we going to go? And so we began a process of adaptive change. And I think this is important. I put this quote in here. The actions involved in enabling an organism to thrive in a new or challenging environment. The adaptive process is both conservative and progressive, in that it enables the living system to take the best from its traditions, identity, and history into the future. I'm going to read that again. The adaptive process is both conservative and progressive, in that it enables the living system to take the best from its traditions, identity, and history into the future. So we began a process of trying to determine how are we going to adapt in an environment as a church where we don't have a building. I love this quote. Where we find difficulty, we may always expect that a discovery awaits us. We had difficulty. We had to discover what awaited us. We initiated a 2-year discipleship plan. You can click to the next one. Okay. And I'm going to hit this really quick and then get to the meat of what I really want to talk about. But for those of you that were at Leadership Focus last year, you heard from Mark Tidsworth. Mark wrote a book called Shift, 3 Big Moves for the 21st Century Church. We initiated that process in January of last year. And the 3 undergirding questions of Shift: what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus Christ? What does it mean to be a gathered community of disciples of Jesus Christ? And what does it mean to be a gathered community of disciples of Jesus Christ joining God's mission? Those were the three questions that we sort of had to wrap our heads around and begin to answer. The moves that Mark talks about in the book and that we began a process of trying to live into are moving from a focus of member identity to disciple identity, moving from an attractional church model to a missional church model, and moving from a consumer church to sacred partnering. In addition to that, however, we also employed the assistance of Ruth and the Living Our Story in Faith, Love, and Hope. This is a program, if any of you are not familiar with it, I encourage you to familiarize yourself with it. It basically incorporates a process of planning, visioning, and in the visioning process, there's asset mapping or gift analysis. There's a mission insight, which will analyze the demographics of the community around your congregation, or around your church building. And there's also a period of discernment that ties all this together with dreams and possibilities, and then there's actually carrying out what you find out. Now, when we went through this, before you click to the next one, when we went through this process of asset mapping, now you got to remember the context of the Peace Congregation. Their dream was dead. They had this dream to build this building and have this wonderful, vibrant church community. It was gone. When I got there, they were on life support. Their image had taken a huge hit, and their identity was still wrapped up in their building that they no longer had. So when we began the process of asset mapping, when we first began going through the process and Ruth was leading us through it, I could hear mumbling in the background, "We don't have any assets." Now, I knew that two things were going to come up one of which was going to be music. Right now, our average worship attendance is about 35. We have 35, 45 people in the congregation right now that are active. Probably a third or a quarter of them are in the choir. So obviously music was going to be something that was very important. So when we started doing the asset mapping, I knew that was going to come out. And it did. The second thing I knew was going to come out was cooking and barbecues. We're big on cooking and eating, and our men have our men's brotherhood do barbecues during the year. It's a big event. They raise lots of money for missions, and it's a big part of who Peace is. And so I knew those things were going to come out. So again, even as pastor, I was somewhat jaded going into this process, going on, this is going to happen, and this is going to... I knew the results. But I didn't expect this. As we went through this process, we discovered that we had 4 nurses, a physical therapist, an oncology massage therapist, 2 hospice volunteers, 3 Stephen ministers, a volunteer at the VA hospital, our preschool director who cares for little ones. And I spent 20 plus years, I'm a second career pastor, I spent 20 plus years in long-term care. I started looking at that. When that came out, I was like, when you only got 35 or 40 people, that's pretty significant. And after the event, Ruth and I stood outside in the rain, and I was like, I didn't see that coming. What does that mean? Let me get the next one. Now, Peace had already gone through, before I got there, they'd gone through a visioning process or developing a mission statement. And some of the parts of the mission statement included these words: nourishing, compassion, conversation, discipleship. And so I started thinking, okay, well, I've got this thing here with all these people that have this healthcare background, and we're talking about nourishing and compassion. How does all this fit together? Can you get it? And it was sort of revealed to me, we're a community of caregivers. That's our DNA. That's who we are. So then, I started looking at the things that we value. And obviously, like most of your churches, I'm sure, we value corporate worship. We value our music, our choir, and our band. We value community, being together. We value our fellowship. We value the preschool that we have. Even though we don't have the building anymore, we still have the preschool that meets at our old property. We value our cooking and our barbecues. Our traditions, such as our bazaar and our love feasts. We have ministries that we value, where we have ladies that knit prayer shawls, and actually now they're also knitting hats for cancer patients and things along those lines. We're big, our people were big on collecting stuff for ministry. We're still big on that, the collection ministries. But I started looking at all this and it's like, okay, if these are the values, we're a group of caregivers, these are the things that are important to us, who is God calling us to nourish and care for? How can we incorporate these things that we value with the gifts and the assets that we have? How does it all come together? Where might we fit in and be able to nourish the community? What came back to the congregation with the idea, the Lord just sort of gave me an idea. He said, what if we partnered with the retirement community there? And that became our place of worship and our place of ministry, where we could partner with them, provide a worship service for the residents in that community, but also be able to integrate them into the service and be able to minister and care for them in ways. And so that's what we did. I took it back to the congregation loved the idea. Our first worship service, this is one of the places that we're meeting right now. You can see this was our Christmas love feast. The first time we had our service there, I gotta admit I was a little hesitant as to how people were going to respond. The first service, people were coming up to me and going, we love it here. We meet 2 Sundays a month. The Catholic Church has the other 2 Sundays. But they loved it, and they said, we should be here every week. What has now transpired is we have a core group of the residents of the community that come and worship with us every week. We're building relationships with them. The number of residents that come continue to grow. We have, a core group that comes every week. They're even, believe it or not, they're even coming and giving as stewards to the service. We don't ask for them to, we don't even, so that we're not seen as going in and soliciting, we don't even take up an offering. But they have started giving back just because they appreciate the community that we're bringing there. The second Sunday we were at this community, we had communion. After communion, I went up to greet one of the little residents. And she's sitting there and she's crying. And she said, I'm just so happy to be here. I'm just so happy to be here. And she looked beside her, the family that was beside her, and she said, I got to meet this wonderful family here. It was so meaningful to her. And the other residents came up and said, we'll be here every week you're here. A member of Peace is actually a resident there. And she'd gotten to the point where she couldn't come to our services anymore. And when we started going there, she came up with tears in her eyes going, I couldn't come to church, so you came to me. It's not traditional. It's not for everybody. But for Peace, it's working. The second picture you have down here is, you see, this is another retirement community that because we only meet 2 Sundays a month at this facility, we're exploring the option of meeting at another community. We held a service in December. We're going to actually hold a couple of more in March too. Doing what we call a holy experiment. Mark Hidsworth talks about holy experimenting. And that's what we're trying to do. But what we're finding, what I'm observing, and it's really cool to watch, is a group of people who, again, when I came, they were on life support. When I got there, they were on life support. And their view of church was that building. Now, this is their view of the church. And they see themselves as the church and not the building as the church. And that's been really cool to watch.
Amen.
So how do we take the church to the community? We're in a unique situation that we don't have a building. You guys are in a unique position in that you have a building. Cabin or shelter. We don't have a cabin.
Rusty, where are you the other 2 Sundays now?
We worship at a local school.
School.
And we have been. We started at the school right after we left the Moravian house. And we tried that, just so you guys know, we tried reaching out and ministering at that school and plugging in there. We got absolutely no traction. The school didn't need us. And they made that clear in a lot of ways. We tried to reach out and do the same thing we're doing at the retirement community, but it didn't take hold. This has really resonated.
Well, and good, because it pushed you out to look for the other.
And ultimately, I don't know if this is where we'll ultimately end up. But what this has taught us is that the church isn't a building. The church, we are the church. And God has placed us here to be on mission and to take His light into the world.
Tell the story about when you all were in the Moravian house behind the church and people had to drive by and see.
Oh yeah. Well, when I first got there, like I said, we were still meeting in the Moravian house. We'd sold the property. But we still had our worship services in the Moravian house, which was just at the very back of the property. So every Sunday when the members of peace would come in, you would literally drive by the old sanctuary, which was, they no longer had, and the new church that came in had hundreds of people showing up every Sunday. And they had little ones out the wazoo. All the things that peace wanted for that property, and that their dream was that when they built that property, so I've been told, their vision was, we'll have hundreds of people worshiping on this property every week, and we'll have lots of little ones running around. And as they pulled in every Sunday to go to the Moravian house, all that was happening, but it wasn't happening through them. And it was like rubbing salt in the wound. And I tried to tell them that, or impress upon them, you had a vision. This is what God wanted. You had a vision for this property. God wanted hundreds of people. You wanted hundreds of people to worship on this property. You wanted all these little ones. It's happened. It just didn't happen how you thought it would. But you built it, and if you hadn't built it, then all of this wouldn't be happening. But now God's calling us to take it and go somewhere else. And so that's what we're trying to live into.
I'm Amanda Schumpert. I'm the Director of Music and Education here, and I did not grow up Moravian. I did not grow up in Winston-Salem, and my mother thought for the longest time when I started working for Calvary that I was working for the Mormons. So she didn't know what the Moravians were. So we've cleared that up. But it's funny, as you were talking, the grass is always greener, right? I mean, typically, because I don't know if many of you know, but last year the ceiling collapsed in our sanctuary. And so we spent a year displaced in our fellowship hall, which is not really that big of a sacrifice. But it was hard to try to come up with enough room to have meetings and have lunches and have, we had chairs spread out, and we would give directives during the announcements of, okay, after worship, every other row gets to stack these, and tables have to come out. And so, as I'm sure many of you know, the thousands upon thousands of dollars that we spend every year on our buildings. So, grass is always greener. But I came to Calvary in a myriad of capacities, but I came in 2009 to sing in the choir and direct their children's choir and their handbell choir, our handbell choir. And I don't have a very large background in church work, but I had experienced some from my college days, and then I'm an opera singer. Was my, so I'm telling you this not because that's important, but because I come from an arts background, and I find it very interesting that I get to serve a church that was founded by a town that's founded by the Moravians and calls themselves a city of arts and innovation. So I really love those two, the juxtaposition of those two things. And when I first started as the Director of Christian Education, we had the initial conversation. It was around the same time that Calvary had been called a fortress. And so I'm here today to just tell you a little bit about our path. The staff, the joint boards at the time, had this dream that Calvary would be an alive congregation. That every week, every day, something would be happening in one of our biggest assets, our building. We're in a huge footprint, downtown Winston, and the revitalization of downtown is happening. So we're at a good spot, but we can't expect you to come to us. Like, we have to be uncomfortable. We have to open the doors. We have to clean up messes that other people make, and that's okay. We had two conversations with other people, unbeknownst to each other. In 2014, 15-ish, the Bookmarks Festival had just expanded beyond their use of the Milton Roads. Wait a minute, where am I? Is it Milton Roads here? The Milton Roads. The Milton Roads parking lot. And they had outgrown that. And this was before they had created the bookstore that's across the street that if you haven't been to, you should totally go to because it's very full of bookmarks. And they had contacted us to use our space for parking. And so Lane, after the festival, Lane contacted their director, Ginger Hendricks, and said, if there's a way we can ever partner with you, you just let us know. We want to do that. We want to see what we got going. And I, coming from my opera singer days, I had gone to school at UNCSA, and around the same time, Piedmont Opera bought the house 2 doors down from us on Holly Avenue, and it's the Piedmont Opera House. And their artistic director called before they purchased the house, and he said, okay, you can't tell anybody this because it's not common knowledge, but we think somebody, a benefactor is going to buy the house for us so that we can relocate our offices. But he said, we can't do that without you all. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he said, well, it's a house, so we're going to have an office space, but we don't have rehearsal space, we don't have a piano, we don't have any area to do our job. I said, okay. He said, I just need to know if we purchase that house, can I call you? And I said, absolutely. We'll see what we can do. Not that I make any decisions, but here we go. So we've been in a strategic planning process since, 2014. We had one that failed, which I think is really important to know. Really, really important to know that you got to try something, right? And it failed miserably. But from all of those, it didn't fail miserably, I didn't mean that, but it did not work.
It was not successful.
Thank you very much, Bishop. But from that, we got a lot of really great ideas. And so we just decided as a staff and as a joint board and as a membership that we just start checking those boxes off. And some of that was signage, some of that was improving the outside of the building and making us look less like a large brick fortress in the middle of downtown. Cleaning up our painting, cleaning up the space, like just making it inviting for us and for the people that we were hoping to invite in. And then we started another one in 2017. And that one we are still in the midst of that. And what's really interesting is, in my perspective, is that we're not finished with that strategic planning process. But we've started doing it. Like, rather than waiting until we have the plan, and we're going to take the plan and we're going to execute the plan, we've started saying, okay, here we are, and every hurdle we jump over, we find 5 new hurdles ahead of us. And that's really cool. Like, the momentum of that is hard and uncomfortable, but a really neat process to be engaged with. So I'm talking a lot about our building, first of all, because it's this sort of opposite side of the spectrum from what we heard from Rusty, but also because when we did our asset mapping, Calvarys Building was one of her biggest assets. So 2016, after we had had these conversations and several months had gone by, Ginger calls and says, okay, we are having a huge festival next year. It's going to be our biggest yet, and we need author space, and we need to host a breakfast. Can Calvary do that? It was all day, 12-hour time span, 2017, for Book Mars Festival, and we did. And we had their authors, people were coming in and out of the building. They hosted a breakfast down here with author discussions. They used classrooms all over the building, and that was neat. That was one day, that was cool. And Jamie Alberton, their director of Piedmont Opera, called, and he said, okay, it's time for the opera. I need 5 weeks of chorus rehearsal space on Tuesday evenings. I said, okay, well, I'll ask. Let's see what we've got. Nobody uses our building on a Tuesday evening, so there you go. So since 2016, I guess, they've used our sanctuary for choir rehearsals every Tuesday night for 10, 12, 15 weeks out of the year at different times. We started having more and more organizations downtown as the downtown was revitalizing. There's still not a lot of space down here. So people get office buildings or they get structures, but they don't have everything to maintain what it is that they do. So they need buildings and structures with a large footprint, which we have. So we've had organizations, the YMCA meets here, Wake Forest, Piedmont Opera, we have provincial groups that meet here. And last year we started the Winston-Salem Youth Chorus. Had met at St. Timothy's for years, well, St. Paul's for years, St. Timothy's for years, and they were without a home. And I will say, the first request we denied because it's a lot of time for them to be in the building. And then Piedmont Opera took them over, and they dissolved their 501c3 nonprofit status and went under the umbrella of Piedmont Opera. And so Jamie called back and he said, I have got 60 kids that need a rehearsal space twice a week, every night, for 9 months. And I said, oh, okay. And so he came and talked to the joint board, and that was probably our most uncomfortable sell. But it's music, which the Moravians love, and it's children, which the Moravians love. And so we said we'd give it a shot for 9 months. And so now every week they're here on Mondays for 5 hours and Thursdays for 5 hours. And they use the building and use our piano and enjoy the space that we have. The other huge hurdle was Salem Presbyterian, who had met, I'm going to say this wrong so you correct me, they had met at Redeemer. They were an offset of Redeemer Presbyterian, and they had met at Green Street for years, and Green Street was undergoing renovation, and they had to find a new home. So they asked if they could use Calvary for a summer on Sunday evenings. And we said, well, that's kind of cool, because the beginnings of Calvary, we were one of the first churches, this structure in the 20s that was built, we were one of the first completed churches downtown, or at least completed in a way that could house worship. And so we met here, and a group from St. Paul's met here while they were waiting on their construction, and a group from First on Fifth met here while they were waiting on their construction. So what a cool juxtaposition of time, where Salem is a nomadic congregation. They don't want a building. They want to do worship differently. And so they met here for a summer and they liked it. And so they said, we want to stay. And so we said, okay, worked through all of that, and they stayed. And then the ceiling collapsed, and so they had to go somewhere else. And then we spent a lot of money or a lot of time fixing the sanctuary. And then we said, okay, well, all of these people still have a part of our church life. So they're coming back. And then we had stains on the carpet, the new carpet, and scratches on the new finished pews. And sometimes the door was left open. And like all of these things that everybody was just like, okay, no. We just spent all this time and energy and money. We can't do this. But we have, up until this point, worked through those issues and talked about those issues and tried to maintain our identity of trying to do our best to open the doors. And we have four sections to our strategic plan, our current strategic plan, and that's looking at congregational care. So there's 2 internal and 2 external. Congregational care, which is caring for the membership of our church family. Community care, which is the sort of outreach ministry that we have in our area. Faith development, which is internal, and then engaging and maintaining relevance in our downtown setting. So that's building usage and how we can be a partnership with all of these other organizations that are coming back downtown.
Say one thing.
Yeah.
One thing that's happened as a result of this that's been really enlightening to me. People used to tell me, I don't know where Calvary is. Where is Calvary? And we'd say, oh, it's across from the Sawtooth Building. They know where we're. But since we started having all these community groups in the church, it's amazing to me the answer I get now. I'm getting a little bit different answer. And then a couple of ladies were coming out of one of the bookmarks lectures, one of the authors, and she said to me, she said, I don't go to church, but she said, I sure do like it that your church is opening its doors to the community. And I went, bingo. You know, you never know when somebody walks through the doors of this church how they may be influenced for Christ in some way. And I think that's where it's been hard for us, because sometimes I think we want to, in our attitudes, we want to hunker down and say, this is our little cabin. Don't come in here and mess up our cabin. And then we have to remember, you know, Christ calls us to be a shelter, and that's a hard tension.
That's where complacent comes in too. You know, you get members that are, you know, that get involved and then get comfortable, and then, you know, sometimes we tend to forget that door has to be open.
Yep.
Well, not only that, it's like, how are you ready for what's going to happen when you open that door?
Exactly.
Because you don't know. That's like all of a sudden we were kind of like just a big building out in the middle of Tobaccoville, Rural Hall, and Girl Scouts came to us and said, wow, y'all got this great big building. Can we have meetings here? And now all of a sudden the whole top floor of our building is full of Girl Scouts. They come, you know, every other week, and their parents. And then you get to talk to their parents and get to know them, invite them to, we started doing a community meal. So we've just kind of started feeling our way around, you know, out in the middle of farm country. What can we do for our community?
And it's all about building those relationships. I mean, that's what church is building the relationships with our neighbors and having conversations that are both comfortable and uncomfortable.
And the elder and trustee, I mean, we have a really good relationship between our elders and trustees. But I think the elders are more, well, let's open the church doors and let anybody in. And the trustees are going, okay, just pay for the toilet paper, paper towel. You know, so we've really, I think we've had to work really hard on that. And we've come up with a fee structure that's reasonable. And we'll sometimes adjust that when there's groups that we know can't handle that. But that's been a whole part of the process too.
And for us, the cabin or shelter question really, I think, was we're a little bit of both and. One of the things that God has given to us for our care is our building. And how can we be a shelter, a cabin for our membership and what God has given us, but also be a shelter to anyone that needs our space and needs our community and needs the love of our membership and the openness and the welcomeness. And some days that's really easy and some days it's just not. But it's been a really, personally, like, I felt very blessed to be part of the process.
I gotta say, I can't sit here without saying this. I grew up Presbyterian in a big church. I went to Clemens when I came, to the Board of Cooperative Ministries, a big church. Well, about 10 years ago, 3 of us had a dream that some people weren't comfortable in a church building. They wanted to worship, but they wanted to reach out. And I took a leap of faith, I would say that, in forming what we call Come and Worship, which is a coffee house ministry. And it's now on Liberty Street. It used to be on Trade Street. That coffee house closed, and we moved right behind it to a coffee house on Liberty Street. And when we sit there on Sunday mornings and worship, and it's a very Moravian service, but it's a blend of tradition and contemporary. When we sit there and somebody comes to the door of that coffee house and they start to walk away, we go out and say, no, you come and you get your coffee. You're welcome to stay and worship with us, or you're welcome to leave. And you'd be amazed at the number of people who have been intrigued with just, oh, this is really cool to have this kind of ministry going on right here in downtown Winston-Salem. And, I never thought I could say this, but I can't go back into a church. I mean, I am that ingrained in what is happening in that community. And it is a very much of a community.
I got a question. What do you do, how do you do when you've got a small handful of shelter minds in a group of large minority of cabin minds? How do you convince these people that opening the doors and getting scratched furniture and missing things in the kitchen and all the little nitpicky, well, who left this mess? They didn't clean this. How do you get them out of that mode? What?
We probably have different answers, but I would suspect.
I'll take both.
I would suspect that that you can't, and that it's not necessary. I would say we have a demographic at Calvary that is very focused on the congregational care and the faith development and the aspects that are cabin in nature, and we have a demographic at Calvary that are shelter in nature, and that there's room for both, I think, and we have to, I think the process for us was learning to exist together. And
that's a mountain.
It is.
I think it's a process, and it takes a long time. And I'll give an example of it.
Well, by the end, most of us would die.
There was some concern about, there were some concerns about Salem Pres and some things that were happening. They have communion, and they use grape juice on one side of the sanctuary and wine on the other. And people were coming up and doing intinction with their bread, and they were walking away from the chalice and they were dripping. Mm-hmm. Okay? Well, we tried all kinds of things, mats and everything. Well, finally, there was just a lot of tension about it. And I said, why don't we all get together? So some of the elders, the pastors at Salem Pres, some of our elders, trustees, we all sat down together at a table. And we talked. And we told each other our stories. And wasn't that meeting, it was miraculous what happened when everybody heard each other's stories. And it was relationships. Because if people come into the building and they're just using the building and you're not ever getting to know them or interacting with them, I think that's the basis of the change. But it takes a long time. And we're still in that. We don't have this thing conquered.
I've got a house full of people that have been there since their grandmother started the church, and they've had family there, and they're ingrained there, and they're strictly Moravian, and they come on Sunday and they go home and you see them Sunday after next, you know. And I don't see them gelling with a group that's going to open the doors and push out into the community and do things that I'm making a list of to bring up, you know. It just is, it's a hard matter.
I think it's important to talk about, just to talk about the fact that it's hard.
Yes.
Exactly.
I'm in my position with cooperative ministries. I have a lot of those conversations with churches, and I often lead with the whole, we all want growth. We all talk about how we want to grow the church, but growth means change. You know, those 60 families with kids suddenly walked in your door. Things don't change, and change is really hard, and at the root of change is loss, because even with growth, we lose things. There's things we don't have, and so we talk about adaptive change, but even for me, my whole gig really is about change and helping lead the church, be with the church as it moves into this new era, and yet they changed my seat in the choir at Unity, and I was sitting there. I have sat in this corner in the alto section for 20 years, literally 20 years, and you want me to move over to the other side, the front row, and then the next week they moved me to the front row. I was like, oh, and I'm just, my mantra is, it's a non-essential, it's a non-essential, it's a non-essential. So I know that if this is a struggle for moi, who is like the queen of change, that, you know, for just our folks coming to church at their beloved building, that these conversations are very uncomfortable. But the more we have them, and the more we talk about the fact that it's hard, and the more we talk about our losses, which are many, then I think that enables us to sort of release some of that and move on into the future, whatever that looks like.
I think two things I want to reiterate. I think in both of our conversations, the stories that we're telling, again, we're just telling our stories.
Right.
But the significance of going through the asset mapping process and discovering what your assets and gifts are. Again, had I not done that, had I not invited Ruth to come in there and lead us through that process, I would have missed, I didn't see that whole caregiver thing. Didn't see it at all. God revealed it to us through that process, just as He revealed what your assets are. And so what we both tried to, I think, to share this is, I highly encourage all of you, if you have not done this, your congregations have not done this, to talk to your leaders about going through that process and discovering what your assets are. And it's not just what your assets are, but how do they connect? Because I think that can give you, at least it did for us, and it sounds like it did for you, it gives you some momentum. Because everybody's got some skin in the game at that point in time. Because we're, as a community, this is what we have. The other point I want to make, and I hope you heard this in what was not said here today. None of the three of us said, in doing this, we're adding members to our congregation. That is not the focus. The focus isn't on growing Peace Church, and I'm assuming it's not on growing Calvary. It's on growing the kingdom. And so what we're trying to find, and we believe we're being called, and we think as a denomination we need to live into, is what are the gifts and assets that God has given us, and how is He calling us to use those for His kingdom, and get past the idea of, if we do this, more people are going to come to our congregation. That's not what it's about. At least that's my opinion. Y'all can disagree, but that's my opinion. And as we live into the kingdom, and as we see that and use God's gift, it brings life and vitality. Again, I go back to what we talked about initially when we were planning this. We're so many of our congregations are stuck in survival and maintenance. How can we pay the bills? How can we pay the utility? How can we do that? And we've got to find ways to get beyond that. Because that, again, that was Peace's problem. And it sucked them dry. They didn't have any life. This is, as we get out and use our gifts for the kingdom, God brings us life. And we got to find ways to do that. And not everybody's going to get on board.
But when you think about the life and ministry of Jesus, the hospitality piece, and the being a servant. I mean, how many times did Jesus talk about servanthood? And isn't the church called to be a servant to the community it serves? And servants don't always look at all the costs that are going to be involved. They just serve.
And if you look at the assets, if the congregation is committed to looking at the assets they have and that they can bring to the table, you'll find one thing to have common ground on. And I think that's where it starts, is finding the one thing that we can all go, we can do that.
Somebody fill me in a little bit on this asset planning. It is planning.
Asset mapping.
Planning.
Gift analysis.
Mapping.
Yeah.
Now, is this something that your board's going to do, or is this something the congregation's going to do?
Well, they're looking back at me.
I mean, I have an exercise, but I don't know that we have time for it.
We really planned on doing that, but we talked.
So the brief exercise I was going to look at today was just, I've got scraps of paper, and all I was going to have you do is write down any physical asset that your church has. Land, property, building, furniture, physical structures. Do you have a shelter? Do you have a fellowship center? Do you have off-site offices? Like, what do you have? And then member-specific assets, which is a lot of what Peace did. So your professions, retired professions, passions of those that are active in the congregation, cooking, administration, childcare, principals, crafty people, that's not me. And what are the immediate needs of those around your church footprint? So do you have a senior care facility? Are you near a daycare or a school, a hospital, a food bank, a park, a rehab center, other churches? Like, is part of your work to combine with other churches? So,
yeah, Ruth has an entire program that she will lead congregations
Yeah, I'd be
through.
happy to come to Little Church and do
Yeah.
that.
I can't invite you, but I'm going to work on it. I just act like I can have influence.
Sure. And yes, it's really, it's all your gifts. It's very much a strengths-based approach. And, it's even things like, what associations and organizations are your members part of that could lead to potential community partnerships? What ministries are you doing now that you could do better? Or what ministries are you doing now that you could let go of in order to do the thing you discover from your gifts inventory? So it is very much a hopeful process and a process that can produce some energy. Often the hardest part is then the now what question. After you kind of get through it, it's like, okay, how are we going to make it happen? And that can be challenging, but certainly possible.
And the other thing, and I shared this with Amanda and Lane, I sometimes get so caught up in the corporate asset thing that I also forget that we also have individual assets. And just because the congregation may be called, as a congregation, we may be called to something together, doesn't mean that I might not have gifts and assets that I can use in other places and in other ministries. So we need to make sure that we look at our collective assets, but we also look at our individual gifts and assets and find ways that we can be extensions of our congregations individually as well. I think that's important as well.
You know, and I think that this whole process is helping us not sit around and talk about what we don't have.
Right, right.
You know, we don't have the marriage used to have, we don't have the children used to have, we don't have this, we don't have that. And the asset mapping helps you say, these are the things we do have. These are the strengths. How can we use these for God in this community?